Welcome to another edition of the Bekaert podcast on the topic of trust in government. I'm Srikant Sastry, and I lead advisory services for Bekaert. I'm delighted to be joined again by Ed DeSev, Executive Fellow at the IBM Center for the Business of Government and coordinator of the Agile Government Center at the National Academy of Public Administration. Hey, Ed, it's good to be with you again.
Srikant, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Fantastic. We ready to talk trust?
Let's talk trust.
Let's do it. So we are recording this series of podcasts to dive deeper into the topic of trust in government, with a particular focus on the OECD's framework for assessing and improving trust in government. This time, we are talking about another of the OECD drivers, responsiveness. It's often said that trust and confidence in government is strongest at the local level, because that's where government is closest and most responsive, frankly, to the people. Today's guests are Catherine Barrett and Richard Greene, who have spent the better part of the last 30 years covering state and local government. They contributed a couple of articles recently to Route 50, arguing that trust in state and local government is on the decline. But there are clear ways to reverse this trend. Welcome to the podcast, Catherine and Richard.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, thank you.
And I understand you've written a book recently, The Little Guide for
The Little Guide to Writing for Impact.
The Little Guide for Writing for Impact. There should be the guide for speaking with for impact too. But can you tell us a little bit about the book?
That's a great question to ask, but we'll keep it very, very short because we should be talking about trust. The idea was that there was so much good information being provided through the academic world, written in academia so that practitioners couldn't really understand it. And we got together with Don Kettle, an esteemed academician, to put together a little guide, as we say in the title, to help people to translate from academia to plain English to the kind of things that can actually have impact in the real world.
Well, I think there's direct relevance to trust. Plain English translates into more trust than perhaps jargony English. But with that, let's get into the discussion on trust. The articles you wrote for Route 50, what motivated you to write the series?
What motivated us actually was coming across a little bit of interesting data, because for years we had seen and understood to be the case that it was the federal government that had the problem, not the states or localities. And that's true. It's certainly far worse at the federal level than the state and local level. Worse meaning less trust. But then we came across some reports that have been done by Polco, which is a company that does all kinds of data analysis, that were showing that, the trust level in state and local government was not as high as we thought. And as I think we say at the beginning of one of the articles we wrote for Route 50, to talk about, it's like saying I have a flu and that's fine because I don't have pneumonia. That's kind of the case here, that there's a real problem in the states and localities that gets ignored because everybody's paying attention to how untrustable or untrusting people are in the feds.
I think one of the big points is that it is declining, that the people who say that they have a negative view rose from 40% in 2017 to 45% now, and you don't want to see it going in the wrong direction.
And that's a pretty big number when you think about it.
So it's a big number, but how important is it? Why do we care about trust in government?
A number of reasons. I guess the first one that comes to mind is that when people don't trust government, they're disinclined to be engaged in government. They're disinclined to work with their government leaders on accomplishing things. So you really want an involved citizenry in any city or any state or any county. If you really want to get things done, they don't show up to board meetings. They don't come up to city council meetings. They say, "Oh, they're all just a bunch of political hooligans, and we don't really care."
They don't vote for ballot initiatives.
Right. Well, that's it too. And I was about to say that they don't, bond issues don't pass. And then another big problem lately has been fewer people are applying for jobs in government, state and local. And there's this tremendous workforce shortage, which is continuing now. It's gotten a little bit better, but still, it's. I don't know. Somebody said to us, maybe you'll remember this, but they taught a class and they would ask people, how many people in the class, how many students would apply for a job in government, and a third of the class, half of the class would raise their hands, and now the same professor sees a couple of hands go up, and that's it.
Let me ask you a couple of quick questions. When we look at the federal government, we see that Congress is the least trusted organization in government at any level. And it's really the infighting and the policies and procedures. This whole border policy debate is just a disaster. But when we separate out the agencies, when we look at the Department of Veterans Affairs, when we look at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, we look at the National Institutes of Health, we find high levels of trust. We find that confidence in these organizations is really quite high. How do we separate that in the minds of the public? Can we say to the public, look, we understand that you don't like Congress as a whole, but you like your congressman. We understand that you don't like government as a whole, but you like the agencies with which you interact. When we look at the OECD questionnaire, we find there's a lot of that teased out of that questionnaire. Have you found the same thing?
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, what we found just in casual conversations with people is a tremendous ignorance about even the idea that government exists as opposed to politics. People just don't think about government, and they don't think at all about government management, which is something that we've concentrated on through our working life. And I think that's a real problem. And I mean, it's also true that it depends on what agencies people are dealing with. They tend to trust more the ones that are helping them, and they trust less law enforcement or other organizations that have more of an enforcement aspect to them, or say that that are more likely to find them. The Department of Motor Vehicles, the places where they're more likely to run into just minor inconveniences.
Is there a prescription that you found for, it's a loaded question because I think that the Agile Government Framework that we're looking at has some potential, but have you found a nostrum, have you found a prescription for improving trust in government's competence in government management? Again, separating the two, having the yolk over here and the white over there, separating the two and trying to say, here's how you can improve trust in your government's management.
It's interesting, you use the word prescription, and what immediately comes to mind are prescriptions for mental illness. Typically speaking, there's no one drug. Typically speaking, you find the combination of medications that'll help people solve their problems. And here it is too. One area that we talked about, some of the articles, and we've written about subsequently, is there's a great deal of work being done in performance measurement and performance management. But when governments only use the performance measurements to tell people, hey, look how great things are, look how great the roads are, and people drive on the roads and they know they're not so hot, you lose faith. When you are more transparent about the kind of measures you're gathering, it tends to, including saying to people, we're not doing a very good job here, but we're going to improve, and here's how. That's a way to generate trust, as opposed to just using the measures to say, we're hot stuff, re-elect us next time you get a chance in the ballot box.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the kind of obvious keys is just doing this well, being honest about what you're reporting to people, because people will immediately perceive dishonesty, and also being timely in what you're reporting, because you can say it's great to be transparent, but if your last bit of transparent information came from 2017 and it's now 2024, it's not going to do anybody any good. The one thing I wanted to add to what you said is, Rich, is one of the things that made us really feel kind of optimistic in working on this research and the reporting for the Route 50 pieces was that the National Research Center, which is great at data, could see from its polls that there were governments that were really doing something about the level of trust, and that there are ways that through communicating more effectively with citizens and taking other actions, I mean, listening to what your residents say, that you really that the data comes out looking a lot better.
It's also worthy of note, as long as you mention the dysfunctionality of the Congress today and that leading to a lack of faith in the federal government. There's been a trickle-down effect here. As people trust the federal government less, and as people find it very difficult to distinguish between the different levels of government. I mean, people don't know when they walk out of their house whether the road they're getting on is a state road, a county road, a town road, or one that's run by the federal government. As we lose that kind of distinction between who runs what, the real problems we're seeing at the federal level are trickling down to the states and localities. And the solution, the prescription there, would be to make it more abundantly clear, here's what we're doing. And this is an educational thing. And whenever the answer to a question is educate people better, that's a tough thing to do, because it's always hard to educate people more. But to the extent that that can be tried, it's a worthwhile effort.
Yeah, well, clearly the level of civics education is something that leaves something to be desired in terms of differentiating between what's federal, what's in state and local jurisdiction, et cetera. Let me ask you, as we think about, you mentioned performance information and performance data, which lends itself really to the notion of digital government. What's the impact of the increased digitalization of government services, and how's that bearing on trust?
That's a great question. It's made a great deal of difference, particularly in smaller communities, smaller entities. It used to be people trusted government because they had a face, and the face was Harvey, who you knew, because you saw him in the store, and you went to get your DMV license renewed, or you went to get your fishing and hunting license renewed, and there you were, and there was Harvey that had a line saying, "Hey, how's it going? The weather's awful. The weather's great." And you trusted Harvey, so you trusted the entity. Increasingly, as more and more services are being delivered electronically, now we're really dependent on the electronics, the technology really working well for you to trust in government. And unfortunately, although we're making great strides in making better and better technology, it still can be a huge pain in the neck. And I don't know anybody who has not at one time or another, when they're trying to deal with government or any other large entity, hasn't spent their time yelling on the phone, customer service, representative, because you're trying to get through to somebody and you're online for 15, 20 minutes. And if you can't get somebody on the phone, if you can't deal with it, the chat bots, which are a great device that more and more governments are using to help people solve their problems, the chat bots are really pretty deeply flawed still.
Well, we're kind of at a transitional time in which you are not getting the right answers. You're not getting answers you want from chat bots, but as artificial intelligence gets better, that will get better too.
Right. So do you see it? Go ahead, Ed. Go ahead.
Pointing out in state and local governments who's doing things well. Give us a couple of examples of where you've seen trust increased by people actually running their governments better. I do some work with GovExcellence at Bloomberg, and I think you do too. And they're really looking carefully at this in places around the world.
We ran across a few interesting places along the way. One of them was Apache Junction, Arizona, which is a small community. It's only got about 40,000 people. But they pride themselves on being able to allow people to get to the website and immediately be able to get contact information so that they can reach out to people. And in fact, I think they mentioned that one of their council people was, in the case with smaller communities, their business people often, has her phone number on the side of a truck. driving around town, and so you can reach the person. They're not anonymous entities. Another one was North Mankato, Minnesota, which has for years citizens like being able to talk in city council meetings. The city administrator said to us, because they could get to the cable access channel. And now one administration canceled that and the other one brought it back. So the capacity of entities to allow people to actually see government in action on their local cable channel is a really, really very useful thing. I know I can't stand watching it, but nonetheless, the idea is estimable.
The sausage factory is on cable. Okay.
Yeah, I mean they're hard to watch because the first 23 minutes in which somebody is complaining to the city council about how the refrigerator doesn't work kind of turns you off a little bit, but we can only do the best we can do.
I want to come back to the place in Arizona that Rich mentioned, because I think this is easier for a smaller town. But one of the drawbacks I think we've seen is that it's getting increasingly hard to find anybody's name on a website. The department head, you can't find their email address anymore. You can't find a telephone number. And so the sense that there's actually a person there who is there to answer, solve your problem kind of disappears. I think that's a real issue. And I mean, and what the place in Arizona did was that, I mean, they have names on their website. They have, who you can contact. And if, I think officials, managers now are kind of a little bit afraid of the public. There have been some negative things happening, a lot of publicity about dangers. But if we can get away from that and get, more comfort in the actual contact between residents and the people who work for government, that would be a lot better.
Yeah, this may be trite and it may be cliched, but I think it's the case that people don't trust government, they trust people.
Well, that said, I think we've got time for one last question, and let's go back to people. What recommendations or advice would you offer public leaders aiming to enhance trust in their respective government institutions?
Be available places other than at ribbon cuttings. I think that there's a real tendency on the part of many officials to only be seen during big happy days. Be out there. I can't help but think back years and years ago to Mayor Koch in New York City when there was the subway strike, and Mayor Koch stood there on the bridge as people were walking across the Brooklyn Bridge from Brooklyn into Manhattan to go to their day jobs, saying, "How am I doing? How's everything?" He was there. He was there in a difficult time, and he was a super popular and very well trusted mayor, at least for his first couple of terms. After that, things got turned around a little bit, but that's a totally other story.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, Catherine and Richard, on this podcast and talking about the important subject of trust in government, and how we understand it and restore it, and for contributing to Cherry Bekaert's ongoing conversation about trust in government.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. It was fun.